Junior Mafia. All right, yeah, I had to get redeem myself from that YMCA song yesterday, so I had to come back with something a little harder. And what's harder than Tupac hit 'em up, right? All right, so let's do this. Let's get back into it. All right, so I want to apologize. I did see the email. I didn't get a chance to respond to it. I've been kind of busy today, so I was like, let me just go in because we do got to finish this documentary up about JFK because tomorrow is President Joe Biden's birthday. All right, so we want to honor the current president. Let me show you why we honor the current president. Because he's the second Catholic president. All right, so we're gonna honor him by looking at the first Catholic president, number 35, which is JFK, John F. K. Right, and number 46 president is Joe Biden. All right, so these three numbers very important to the Catholic Church. All right, we're gonna see how this plays out. But yeah, so the email I received an email today, and it was about two movies that's coming out on guess which day. Shout out this woman. Shout out to this woman. Love this woman. She hooked me up. So two movies coming out this weekend is Wicked, right? And that's the Wizard of Oz movie. The Wizard of Oz, guess what? It was about money. It was about the feds. It's about the big fat cats, bankers, the robber barons. All right. And how they affect the little people. You got Dorothy, who's a little girl, and then you got the Scarecrow, right? The Scarecrow was representing the farmers. The Tin Man representing the union workers. All right, and then you got the Cowardly Lion, who I believe was representing the police. All right, because he didn't get tough until you got that badge or a medal of courage. You know what I'm saying? So, and it's the Wizard of Oz is really layered, right? And the word I was looking for the other day was interest. The fat cats come in and they loan you money, knowing that you can't even pay back the money that they loaning you. But on top of the money that they loaning you, they put interest on top of it, right? And that interest on top of it make it impossible for these countries to pay back. So what the countries do, they sell off their people, right? That's where we get the Social Security coming from. Uh, if I'm if I got a chance, I'll pull that up. You know, the origins of Social Security, and yeah, they'll siphon their people out, sell the country, sell the oil. You know, they'll do whatever to get out of that debt, right? Debt slaves. All right. So in the movie The Wizard of Oz, that's what she represented. The Wicked Witch of the West was interest. She represented interest, right? Her and her little flying monkeys. All right. So you had the Wicked Witch of the West, and you had the Wicked Witch of the East. Matter of fact, she's the Wicked Witch of the West. Kamala Harris is from the West Coast. All right. The Wicked Witch. She got that cackling laugh. I didn't put this stuff on Google. You know what I'm saying? This is what people already been saying about her. She's the witch. Yeah, I know. I ain't too tech savvy anyway to put something up here and Google accept it and puts it up there. It ain't gonna happen, right? This has already been a thing, right? I'm just pointing it out, right? This is her, right? For it to be coming out on November 22nd, the anniversary of the JFK death, right? 2 days after Joe Biden death, and Joe Biden and JFK all connected, right? Through the Catholic Church. This is very interesting that this comes out on this day, right? Wicked. Okay, and then the other movies coming out is Gladiator 2. We've been talking about war, right? But I read a little bit of the plot. I might go check this movie out, right? I read a little bit of the plot, and you know, most of the movie seemed like it's around the Denzel Washington character. Uh, Denzel Washington character is a former slave, right? Who I guess gained some power or some wealth, and his goal in the movie is to overthrow Rome, right? Just like our people's champ, the people's champ is coming to drain the swamp. His supporters hope that he can overthrow the government, Right? That's what they think. They think he's not a part of the government. They think he's not a part of the plan. Right? This is how the master plan is going down. It's already been set up. How long they been thinking about doing Gladiator 2? You think since Gladiator 1? What's a gladiator? It's a warrior, right? Warrior, war. And this movie Wicked is look. This is I got this on Gladiator, right? And look, they're telling me about Wicked. Wicked to win over the world with 165 million to 200 million opening day, right? Gladiator 2 passing 100 million overseas today. Okay, so both of these movies are set to do pretty good, right? This is how we end in the movie. These are probably two Oscar. I know at least Gladiator could be in the Oscar running, right? And hopefully Denzel win. But yeah, it's just funny. Okay, because I showed y'all that Iran and saying, yo, we ain't trying to kill Trump. And like I said, the way you could get Trump is to play on his ego. Trump really don't want war. Everybody thought Trump was gonna be the war president. Yeah, he wasn't the first time. I don't know about this time. This time might be a little different because it seemed like they didn't figure Trump out, right? All you gotta do is play on his ego. You tell Trump that Iran is trying to kill him personally. Then, Lindsey Graham and all these dudes, they might get the results that they've been looking for, right? They might get it. Okay, Trump going down the escalator. I always confuse that with Trump. I thought he went down the elevator, right? He's going down the elevator to take down the elites, right? So yeah, was JFK shot from a sewer? That where we ended up at last time because that just shocked the hell out of me, right? I was appalled, right? I was flabbergasted. Shot from the sewer, and then when you think about it, his head does go up and to the left, right? Now they might show that gruesome image again, all right? But if you paid attention to how JFK got shot, and what happened to his face and all this stuff, this dude that they're gonna show you in the autopsy cannot it cannot possibly be JFK, right? Now, we ain't even got to it yet, and I already didn't figure that out. Like whoever they about to show us in this autopsy is not gonna be JFK. It can't possibly be the same person who was in that car. Let me put it like that, because we seen it, man. They blew half his freaking head off. All right, go to Skull and Bones members, right? Skull and Bones, order 322. This is a very important number, right? Let me show you. So this Sunday, right, when Denver Broncos won on the day of the year, right? And this is the last Sunday football games landed on this date with the 322, right? And Denver goes on to win. Now, let me show you something else, man. Because for it to land on this date, right, November 17th, 322. For it to land on that date, it got to be a leap year. It can only do this on a leap year. November 17th can only land on 322 on a leap year. And let me show you something about November 17th. I don't want to really get rid of that, so let's get rid of this. November 17th, 187, right? 187 is the murder code. The prime 187 is the prime number of 1117. 1117, like November 17th, right? And this is the day that young Dolph died, and we just was talking about Adolf Hitler. Young Dolph's real name was Adolf, right? He rode around with the military cars. He had all his cars wrapped in military camo, right? So this is the executive order that most people believe got JFK killed. Executive order 1111. Wink, wink. All right, the Fed killed JFK because JFK was trying to back the currency. This is just so common sense, right? This is why a lot of people say JFK was the last real president. This is just so common sense. Using a silver backed currency issued by the Treasury. Right. So he's trying to get rid of the Fed using silver to back the currency. Right. Back in the old days, gold is heavy. So you didn't want to walk around with gold, right? Maybe you got to buy just a piece of bread. You're not about to get this motherfucker your whole piece of gold. You're not about to shave down the gold just enough so you can pay for the stuff. No, what they did was gave you paper to represent your gold. You put your gold in the bank, and the bank gives you paper notes. And then when you want to get your gold, you bring you bring your paper notes in, and they trade you in and they give you your gold. At some point, we lost all the gold. And then people was just left with paper. So JFK is like, yo, we're gonna back it by silver. You know, gold is so expensive and so hard to find. Let's just back it by silver because silver can be melted down and used for different things. That paper, man, you can't even like Young Pharaoh. Shout out to Young Pharaoh. You can't even wipe your ass with it. All right. The only uh real use that it has is, I mean, if you need to burn it to stay warm, that's about it, right? But using silver to back money is just common sense, right? Somewhere along the line, we the banks just, people die, man. And this is another thing. These people figured out how to cheat death, right? That's what that 322, right? 322 Skull and Bones. This is a death cult, right? Why do they love death so much? Because in ancient times, there was a dude who figured out how to cheat death. This is the big secret that they are keeping, right? We're going to get right into the video here in a second. But I got to say this. A dude that we have talked about before figured out how to cheat death. The man who could cheat death. This is ancient. This is old. Somebody back in the olden days figured out how to do it, how to cheat death. Remember Mike Tyson biting? The old man biting, like old man biting. The old man biting. Because it was L. L was the one who figured out how to cheat death with his technology. That's why he got this hat on his head, which turned out people, that was a crown, right? This is just a scepter now, but this is how it was technology, right? Used to cheat death. It was the first man to do it, to cheat death. Now, how did he do it? They figured out the whole world is made up of magnetism and electricity. So that's why he got his name L, because now I can't go into detail about how they do it, right? I don't even think I want to know. What I do know, yeah, this is why they're so crazy about death, because they figured out they're not scared of death. They figured out how to cheat death, store death onto a cloud, right? Technology, cloud. Those are the clouds in heaven, right? And that's why the Boule, they're keeping a secret, right? They show you right here. We're keeping a secret. We don't want you to know about it. And where they hide the secret? In an urn. I had to tell myself, I said, come on, Dave. It's like right there in your face, man. It's in an urn, bro. That's the big secret that they trying to keep. Somebody can't die and have been living on this earth for a long, long time. This is the motherfucker who the Pope is praying to, who all these people are scared of, is this person who's been on this earth. And could be people. It could be like the royal family, a royal bloodline of somebody who figured out they can't die and they can cheat death. And they loaded their consciousness up to, this is just my theory. They loaded their consciousness up to a cloud, or AKA a computer, right? A cloud, or AKA a computer. Okay, so we got another political, got a political sports game going on today, a basketball game. It's a big game, huge game, right? Two of the best teams in the league gonna play tonight. What's today? Tuesday, Morris Day. Uh, Cleveland Cavaliers. Like I said, I was keeping an eye out for Cleveland to see what Trump was gonna do. Cleveland still undefeated. Still, they 15-0, right? And you got the Boston Celtics. Joe Biden, Secret Service code name is Celtic, right? This is I ain't gonna go down that road, right? So Celtic, the Druids, going against the Cleveland Cavaliers tonight. Uh, so Trump is connected to the Cavaliers. The Cavaliers are connected to King Charles. King Charles is connected to King Charles II, King Charles I, and King James. All those, there was a lot of King James too, but the main King James is King James I, which is the guy who rewrote the Bible, right? So a lot of connections, right? Even LeBron James connected to this too. He's King James himself, right? So King Charles is who is king right now, right? While these Cavaliers are doing all these winning, King Charles, well known, was connected to a bunch of men called the Cavaliers, right? He was a Cavalier himself too, right? So this big game coming up, the Cleveland Cavaliers could get their 88th win against the Celtics all time tonight, right? And I showed you 88 is Trump, right? 88 is also connected to Back to the Future, right? And Trump is connected to Back to the Future. When we talk about time and all this stuff, right? So, Cleveland Cavaliers this season could get their 16th win this season, right? We're going 16-0. That 16 is a big Trump number too, because it's January 6th, 1-6. So today I'm leaning towards Cleveland Cavaliers, but I hate giving out picks. But we'll be all right. We'll be all right. All right. So yeah, King James assassination, just connected to Donald Trump's assassination. Remember the 5th of November. That was the date of the election. Right. It was also the date. I don't know how I missed this. It was also the date that was in Back to the Future, the first one. Right. That was the date, November 5th, 1955. What was going on November 5th, 1955? That's around the time of Emmett Till. Ladies and gentlemen, that's around the time of Emmett Till. Okay. All right. I think I'm done. I think I got everything that I needed to get. I feel better about myself. This is a beautiful film. All right. Now, where we left off at was the sewer, which I can't lie, that sewer makes a lot of sense.
Us at Gene Hill's feet.
And we probably going to have to deal with one or two commercials, yeah, but don't beat me up too bad about it. All right, let's go.
She did not even notice. But we know this is true because the FBI told him, leaving his bike onto its stand. Look now as we freeze frame him here. This is the moment when the whole world was looking up the hill toward the man who had fired from the grassy knoll. But that is not where the police officer is looking. He is looking down into the storm drain, because that is where that shot at a stationary car came from. The shot, which all of the well-known assassination witnesses described as coming from behind the picket fence, missed completely and ripped up the grass at Gene Hill's feet. She did not even notice, but we know this is true because the FBI told her so. So who were the men who fired unseen from the storm drains on Elm Street? One thing we know is that they were very young and had to be brought into the conspiracy because they had to crawl into a filthy, smelly sewer, something which the older, experienced mafia assassins would never have dreamed of doing. They were basically two kids looking for excitement.
Two kids. I thought if he was going to say it was four of them, I was about to lose my mind. I'm like, these niggas is the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. If it was four young dudes, I just knew. He was about to say it was four young dudes. He said it was two. All right. So it was just Michelangelo and Donatello.
First was Curtis Laverne Crayford, also known as Larry Crayford. Formerly CIA, he had worked for Ruby at the Carousel Club. And Ruby had told everyone his name was Lee Harvey Oswald until Lee Harvey Oswald walked in. But while above ground, the world was taking pictures and running and screaming and trying to figure out what had happened. The other young man was stumbling along 400 yards of a reeking, fetid Dallas sewer pipe to emerge from this culvert. And he was not Lee Harvey Oswald, or Roscoe White, or J.D. Tippit, nor even a Cuban or Russian communist. His name was Jack Allen Lawrence. And we know that after stumbling up this bank, he turned up 15 minutes later at the Lincoln Mercury car showroom, where he'd obtained a job with false references, pale, sweating, and, on a hot, sunny day in Dallas, covered in mud. Telling his co-workers, Albert Bogard and Robert Tater, he had been ill that morning, he stumbled into the men's room and threw up, while they, feeling his behavior was suspicious, called the police, who made a record of the entire incident. Back at the plaza, the guilt of the radio men coordinating the gunfire can be seen from their behavior. These two, Orlando Bosch and the Umbrella Man, have a seat, while everyone else runs around them. Bosch makes a report that the hit was successful, then casually walks away, just like the chief radio coordinator, Jim Hicks, with the radios clearly visible in their back pockets. A few yards away, the CIA's cleanup squad have begun working to remove all evidence useful to a forensic team. Deputy Sheriff Buddy Walters is here seen finding the bullet which struck in the grass near the manhole cover. He hands it on to one of the fake FBI men, who pockets it. While this is going on, Rogers, Harrelson, and E. Howard Hunt are discovered hiding in the boxcars of the train which they hoped would be their getaway vehicle, until it's prevented from moving by railway dispatcher and key witness Lee Bowers. They are photographed repeatedly as they are marched to the Dallas courthouse. And we can clearly see in this picture the radio receiver Hunt is wearing in his right ear, which is identical to the receivers worn by those Dallas police officers who were part of the plot. As they walk, they are overseen by Colonel Ed Lansdale, who secures their release and begins to give the press the cover story that this man is the major suspect and that acting alone he shot the president from behind. The truth, as we now know, is that 8 separate snipers, firing 16 shots in 4 separate stages, had tried to make certain of killing the president by hitting him in the head and had failed abysmally. The shooting on the day had been nothing to write home about. A third of all the shots had missed the car completely. Had it not been for the ruse of bribing the driver to brake at a point painted on the curbside, which is still visible, so that Jack Lawrence could shoot Kennedy in the head from just 15 feet away, the president might have survived. So now we must address the question, why does the Zapruder film not show this very obvious setup of the limousine stopping for the headshot? The answer, of course, is that it has been tampered with. In the 1960s, Hollywood special effects teams had developed techniques for masking off segments of film frames to disguise the true movement of figures within the picture. In the Zapruder film, frames have been removed in order to fake a continuous flowing motion, so that we don't see the very obvious setup which dozens of witnesses reported. If you look now at the top of the frame, the doctoring of the film becomes perfectly obvious in the way in which the figures are blurred and yet the shadows are sharp, which is impossible. This CIA tampering with the evidence becomes even clearer when the Zapruder film is run next to the Orville Nix film taken from the other side. It's easy to see from the way the motorcycles suddenly close on the limousine that it stops completely. And we can see that frames have also been removed from the Nix film by the way in which Agent Clint Hill appears to move sideways while running forwards before leaping on the car. As the mad dash to Parkland Hospital begins, fake a continuous flowing motion so that we don't see the very obvious setup. Which
did y'all see that? In the other film, it clearly stopped.
Dozens of witnesses reported. If you look now at the top of the frame, the doctoring of the film becomes perfectly obvious in the way in which the figures are blurred and yet the shadows are sharp, which is impossible. This CIA tampering with the evidence becomes even clearer when the Zapruder film is run next to the Orville Nix film taken from the other side. It's easy to see from the way the motorcycles suddenly close on the limousine that it stops completely. And we can see that frames have also been removed from the Nix film by the way in which Agent Clint Hill appears to move sideways while running forwards before leaping on the car. As the mad dash to Parkland Hospital begins, the chief coordinator in the assassination plot, George Herbert Walker Bush, casually relaxes with hands in his pockets at the entrance of the school book depository. Now, this is going to be one of those all too familiar Kennedy assassination moments in which people will say, well, yes, it could be him, but how can we be sure? Because we've seen this kind of thing before with Badgeman. However, a gentleman who I think must be a police detective has posted a YouTube video in which he utilizes the latest forensic techniques for identifying murder suspects by making a comparison between the photo taken in Dealey Plaza and one of George Bush in conversation with Richard Nixon during Watergate. This man points out that this person has exactly the same skull shape, exactly the same hairline, chin, and nose as George Bush. He is also wearing the same type of suit, white shirt, and exactly the same type of tie. He is exactly the same height, the same weight, is wearing clothing which matches down to his shoes, but most importantly, he has a characteristic mannerism of cocking his right wrist when he puts his hands in his pockets. We know from this declassified FBI memo that George Bush was in Dallas, staying at the Sheraton on November 22nd. So can there be any doubt about this person's identity? Surrounded by the corrupt policemen he was coordinating, Bush knew already that if an honest officer should happen to catch one of the assassins, it would, because of what Mark Lane rightly calls plausible deniability, make no difference. Because what would they find? Mafia hoods with prison records as long as their arms? Or contract killers like Charles Harrelson? They certainly wouldn't have found anyone who carried CIA credentials or anyone whose involvement with the government could be traced. But even while he smiled and chatted to his fellow killers, Bush was unaware that the plotters had just made their first big mistake. They knew that they had to forensically control the body from the moment the shots were fired. And the moment Kennedy entered Trauma Room 1, that control had to be relinquished. Although they had CIA agents placed in the emergency unit, these people were not aware of the throat wound, which could hardly be seen because it was so tiny. It was at this moment that all the Dallas doctors and nurses like Aubrey Bell made a mental note of this very obvious sign of a frontal entry shot. One of the Dallas medical team, Dr. Charles Crenshaw, a junior doctor at that time, vividly recalls what the first professionals in the Kennedy killing had to deal with.
The second wound was here in the throat, right above the necktie. It was a small opening, very small, 3 to 5 millimeters, about the size of your little finger. I looked at the wound again. I wanted to know and remember this the rest of my life. And the rest of my life, I will always know he was shot from the front.
And also described the portion missing from the rear of Kennedy's head after the impact of the frangible bullet, which hit him in the right temple.
The bullet struck about where and passed about where?
From here,
Right.
through
Taking out
the back of the occipital part, the back of your head. This was gone.
It's approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time today here in Dallas. He died of a gunshot wound.
This information soon made its way to the media. And this is why, at the very first press conference, Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff correctly described the cause of death and direction of the shot. In order to find a means with which to contradict this evidence, the cover-up now began in earnest. With the
See, this is the thing. This is my thing. They didn't have to shoot him. Like, they ain't how you kill presidents. Like, it's always been poison. You know how you kill powerful people? It's always been poison. So for them shooting him in the head like that was an act to put some people in line. That was a show. That was for the show. That was done like that for a reason, and it was brutal like that for a reason. That was setting an example.
summoning from the Westland funeral home of a CIA agent who was known for being the best in the business at reconstructive surgery on cadavers, John Melvin Liggett. This man was actually attending a funeral when he was told of the president's assassination and asked to go to Parkland by the coroner. What he didn't know as he drove away was that one of his clients in this macabre and gruesome story was at that moment still alive. When he was arrested years later by New York police detective Jim Rothstein, Frank Sturgis, on discovering that Rothstein was a Bay of Pigs veteran like himself, got into an old Army buddy's conversation with him and said, first of all, that after the assassination, he returned to the Miami safe house, where he ridiculed Marita Lorenz for missing history. It was all perfectly safe, he told her. No cops, no newspaper investigation. Everything was covered.
I asked Sturgis, Jesus Christ, Frank, did you shoot the president? Did you have something to do with that? He said, who gives a shit? Yeah, who's going to prove it? He said, we kill a lot of people. What the hell's the difference?
Sturgis then went on to say that Dallas police officer J.D. Tibbett was actually gunned down by the radio talk show host G. Gordon Liddy, who was at that time a CIA agent working with E. Howard Hunt. And here we must address a question which puzzled assassination researchers for years. Why did a Dallas policeman have to die within a few minutes of President Kennedy? What possible function could he have played in the overall plot as a corpse? One would think the authorities could have caught the fleeing Patsy without any need to incriminate him any further. So why did the life of J.D. Tibbett also have to end on the 22nd of November, 1963? Where did he fit in? In only the last few years, a wonderful investigator called Robert D. Morningstar discovered one tiny little fact about Jefferson Davis Tibbett, which became the most important single piece in the completion of this puzzle. Because Officer Tibbett had a nickname. When he was at work, his fellow officers always used to call him JFK, because at 39 years of age, he looked exactly like him. In the only well-known picture of Tippett, his Elvis haircut makes him appear very youthful. But having turned grey and having nearly turned 40, most people felt his resemblance to Kennedy was uncanny. What Tippett never knew, as he drove past assassination witnesses Jack Tatum, Domingo Benavides, and Aquila Clemens, was that he had been selected to play the role of the president in death.
Yo, this is crazy. I'm at a loss for words now. This is crazy.
Researchers have always believed it couldn't be a coincidence that Tippett was shot in the right temple, just like JFK some 45 minutes earlier. They wondered why bullets had been removed from his body in the ambulance, and why, when he was pronounced dead on arrival at the Methodist Hospital, it was felt necessary to move his body to Parkland. With their concentration firmly fixed on the casket of the deceased president, the newsmen completely ignored the ambulance which spirited away the body of J.D. Tippett, so that it could be loaded onto Air Force 2, where John Melvin Liggett was waiting. When Kennedy's casket arrived at Love Field a few minutes later, Clint Hill, the agent who jumped on the car, recalled that all the people aboard Air Force One were told they had to go forward to witness the swearing in of Lyndon Baines Johnson. This, of course, was just a ruse to get Jackie Kennedy to leave her husband's body, and the moment she was out of the way, his cadaver was stolen and placed aboard Air Force 2 next to the cadaver of J.D. Tippett. Many people have seen this famous picture in which LBJ is smiling at Congressman Albert Thomas a moment after becoming president, and he is winking back. We haven't known until now just how huge and terrible a secret he was sharing with Johnson, because at that moment on the plane right alongside, the most highly qualified specialist in reconstructive surgery and embalming in the country, John Melvin Liggett, was starting to make a facsimile of the dead president, using the body of J.D. Tippett in order to obscure the true extent of the damage to Kennedy's head and make it seem consistent with a shot from behind. But Liggett realized immediately this was well nigh impossible, because having been told over the radio about the head shot, Liddy took it upon himself to try and ape this damage by firing into Tippett's torso, and then, when he was down, firing into his right temple, instead of into the back of the head as he'd been instructed. This was a second huge mistake. The human brain has a consistency like play school plasticine. Fire a bullet through it, and it is very easy for a skilled pathologist to track the bullet's path at autopsy. What Liggett wanted to show to any investigators was a brain that looked like this. What he had was one brain which looked like this, and another which looked like this. A large portion of Kennedy's brain had been ripped out by the impact of the explosive or frangible bullet, and what remained was filled with tiny shards of lead, some of them microscopic, which might take all night to locate. Liggett was terrified. The plotters had asked him to play Dr. Frankenstein at 30,000 feet. Yet with all his embalming experience, he instantly realized a botched job was the best he could possibly deliver. In his panic, he sawed off Tippett's skull and simply ripped out the entire brain to at least make sure no one could track the bullet which, after Liddy's error, had so obviously come from the wrong direction. He then compounded Liddy's error by making a large hole in the rear of the head to ape the damage to Kennedy's head. With this done, he rebuilt the skull, hurriedly sewed the scalp back together, and then set about the gruesome task of trying to make the cadaver of J.D. Tippett more closely resemble the cadaver of John F. Kennedy. By shaving eyebrows, bringing forward Tippett's slightly more receding hairline, filling in missing segments of both heads with plaster of Paris, and rebuilding portions of the flesh with wax. Liggett performed this ghoulish service while the aircraft he was on, Air Force 2, went...
I had no idea that was going to be that gruesome. Shit. I still got to eat tonight.
to the usual procedure of leapfrogging Air Force One to arrive at Andrews Air Force Base slightly earlier. He wasn't given long enough, and in the rush to get finished, the plotters now made their third and most stupid mistake. Instead of placing Tippett's body in a casket identical to the one aboard Air Force One, they placed him in a Spartan grey metal coffin inside a body bag. As the TV media showed these distressing pictures to a world reeling in shock, it's hardly surprising that no one ever dreamed this casket could be empty, but it was. As it was driven away, out of sight of the media, the two bodies were taken from Air Force 2 and loaded onto a helicopter. It was at this point that the two honest men, FBI agents Francis X. O'Neill and his partner, William Siebert, became crucial figures in the story. They explained to researcher David Lifton that they made the journey to the Naval Hospital at Bethesda in the car behind the hearse, which carried Jackie and Bobby, and most notably, Admiral George Berkeley, who made sure he stayed with the empty coffin by sitting on another man's lap. Upon reaching Bethesda, Seabird and O'Neill said Berkeley then guided the family members into the building while the hearse was ordered to the rear to unload. But that was where the simplicity ended. The FBI men and many other witnesses recalled a scene of absolute mayhem in which no one seemed to know what was going on, and military men were rushing around everywhere, exchanging anecdotes about decoy ambulances they had been ordered to follow, which had become high-speed chases around the hospital grounds as these vehicles raced away. It seems this confusion was created with the intention of misleading both the press and the large respectful crowd which had gathered on the lawn. People were asking each other which ambulance contained the president's body. Then a rumor started that it was coming by helicopter, but which one? Everyone watching that night recalls the air was filled with them, and the FBI men also told Lifton that in the midst of all this mayhem, they helped to carry the casket inside. This was flatly denied by the team of Navy men who said they did it alone. It is therefore perfectly clear that 2 bodies were brought to the morgue separately whilst confusion reigned. And it was now that the plotters themselves became confused by the mayhem they had created, because they left J.D. Tibbetts' cadaver in the wrong casket. It should have been switched and gone into the autopsy room in the large expensive casket used in Dallas.
I helped put President Kennedy's body in a bronze ceremonial casket on November 22nd, 1963 at Parkland Memorial Hospital.
Instead, mortuary technician Paul O'Connor received a coffin so dull and nondescript no one could believe it had been utilized to transport the body of a president.
It was a very plain casket, and when I say plain, I mean it was a pinkish gray. It had pink and gray on the sides. There was nothing fancy about it as far as being bronze. It wasn't bronze.
The autopsy then became a farce the moment it began. While Seabird and O'Neill made their now famous and entirely correct observation that the body seemed to have undergone surgery prior to autopsy, mainly in the head area, Commander Humes himself testified that the moment he touched the head, pieces of the skull fell down onto the autopsy table. That is not possible unless surgery was done before post-mortem. And that surgery could only have been performed aboard the aircraft because there was no other time to do it. Humes then found that he had to try to work with Admirals Berkeley, Galloway, and Kenny actually touching his elbows, and became increasingly confused and embarrassed himself at his utter failure to find any trace of the bullets which killed the president. Of course, this was hardly surprising, considering the president lay dead in an adjoining room, and that Liggett had removed all the bullets from J.D. Tibbett. As the autopsy proceeded, O'Connor revealed that Berkeley interfered constantly in the procedure, steering Humes away from the torso, where he would have found the holes made by Liddy. And while everyone in the room remained aghast and disturbed by the huge hole in the back of the head and absence of any brain matter, 2 porters O'Connor had never seen before came in pushing a trolley, which had a sheet on it which hid a small lump. They had told people in the corridor it was a dead newborn baby, but it turned out to be a complete brain, which could only have come from a 3rd cadaver. This was weighed and pickled in formaldehyde before anyone even had a chance to inquire when it had been removed. The most farcical moment of all came when Humes faced Arlen Specter in front of the Warren Commission and found the leading counsel pressing him to say that the wound he found in the back of the head was an entry wound. His incredible answer was that the bullet could only have entered and exited from the rear. Humes actually told the world that the bullet had done a U-turn inside the president's skull. Now that we know the truth, it may seem remarkable that David Lifton got so close and yet never quite realized that what he had been investigating for 15 years was a body switch. But can we really be surprised? Like so many other decent men, Lifton was simply unable to imagine that anyone could ever think up such a grotesque and degenerate conspiracy. He simply never realized that what he was dealing with was nothing less than the devil himself. And for those who find all this impossible to accept, one of the devils who murdered JFK, Frank Sturgis, was perfectly candid about how routine body switches had become in the CIA by 1963.
There was a switch.
Body switch.
A body switch, yes.
The truth about the autopsy is that the devils who killed Kennedy messed up very badly. They had wanted to show the world actual photographs of a single bullet wound from behind. As it was, they had to resort to a lot of badly faked photographs, which critics like Robert Groden easily discredited, and silly drawings, which everyone realized did not line up anywhere near the schoolbook depository. With the autopsy over, Mrs. Kennedy and the president's brother were shown the body prepared for burial. Not surprisingly, they were wholly unconvinced by Liggett's attempts to make a Dallas police officer look like the President of the United States. Witnesses there at the time said Bobby scoffed and said, "It doesn't look anything like him," while Mrs. Kennedy became adamant. "It isn't Jack," she declared. That looks like something you'd find in Madame Tussauds Wax Museum. Many people have studied this alleged picture of the president's remains and wondered how it could possibly be John F. Kennedy when the Zapruder film clearly shows this right temple area being blown apart by the impact of the frangible bullet. The simple answer is that this is not JFK. It's the corpse of Officer J.D. Tibbet, surgically altered to look like the president. On arriving home, Liggett was informed the plot was in serious trouble. His wife Lois told how he staggered in the door, unkempt, disheveled, and quite obviously exhausted, which was very out of character for a man who took pride in always being neat, tidy, and organized.
It was about 24 hours before I heard from him. He came home and he walked in the door, and when I saw him, he physically looked like he had really been through a very traumatic experience. His clothes were disarrayed, and that was so out of character for him. And he said, "We're going to get out of town for a while until all of this blows over." That was a quote, because I thought, well, what blows over?
Minutes later, they were speeding down the highway towards Corpus Christi, utterly bewildered as to what on earth was going on. Chain smoking at the wheel, Liggett was looking increasingly nervous. It wasn't just that his botched reconstruction had failed to convince and would lead to courtroom testimony of bullets doing U-turns inside the president's head. The problem was that the patsy was still alive. Deputy Sheriff Roger Craig told investigators it was plain to him that Lee Harvey Oswald was not meant to survive his arrest procedure. He said that when he arrived at the Texas Theater, a group of his fellow officers were waiting at the rear, guns drawn, and that it was quite obvious that Oswald was meant to make a break out the back door where he would run into a hail of gunfire. However, Oswald himself was an intelligence agent, and once he realized he had been chosen as the fall guy, he briefly prolonged his existence by loudly yelling so that all the witnesses present could hear, "I am not resisting arrest. I am not resisting arrest." This is why Liggett, like all the others involved in the plot, was shaking in his boots on November 23rd. They were all aware that a sharp lawyer could get Oswald released simply by discovering that the chain of evidence had been broken in relation to Kennedy's remains. Once free to talk, and with intimate knowledge of the major players in the assassination plot, he could have gotten the heads of the FBI and CIA, all the military chiefs of staff, the mafia chieftains, and the Dallas oil men all thrown in jail together for murder. Many people have wondered how the plotters could be so unbelievably dumb and so unbelievably obvious as to have Oswald murdered live on national television. The simple truth was that they had absolutely no choice. Their botched assassination attempt had proved that they were not as smart as they thought they were. The actual shooting had gone very badly. Most of the shots had missed. They'd had to botch the autopsy, and now they were having to botch the silencing of the patsy. Lois Liggett recalled that the moment Ruby fired, the atmosphere in their motel room evaporated.
That looked fake. That's how little Jack Ruby set up. That shit looked fake.
Live on national television. The simple truth was that they had absolutely no choice. Their botched assassination attempt had proved that they were not as smart as they thought they were. The actual shooting had gone very badly. Most of the shots had missed. They'd had to botch the autopsy, and now they were having to botch the silencing of the patsy. Lois Liggett recalled that the moment Ruby fired, the atmosphere in their motel room evaporated.
The minute he saw that, he looked at me and said, "Everything's okay now," and you could just see his face. He was like all the pressure had been taken off of him.
All of a sudden he was like, sigh of relief, let's go, we can go home now. It was basically, pack your things, come on, we're leaving, now we go.
The family turned around and went straight back home to discover that Mr. Liggett now enjoyed a new vocation. It appeared he had suddenly come into millions, which bought his family a big new house and himself a new lifestyle, which included many wild poker parties at which, among others, he hosted David Ferry. This was not Lois Liggett's scene. She divorced him, heard that not long afterwards he was arrested for murder, and then shot dead while trying to escape. But this was not the end of Liggett's story. His new wife told Lois that the man she buried could not have been John Melvin Liggett, because the corpse she was shown had a mustache and he couldn't grow one. Then many years later, Lois Liggett actually saw her deceased ex-husband in a casino while on a trip to Las Vegas. Quite clearly, this man had been the beneficiary of yet another CIA body switch. And to this day, doubts remain as to the true fate of Jack Ruby, Lee Oswald, John Liggett, and the president himself. Many researchers now believe the plotters may have kept Kennedy's remains as a souvenir and buried J.D. Tibbet in Arlington Cemetery. All added together, the pilots, spotters, radio men, mafia assassins, embalmers, physicians, and corrupt agents from the FBI, CIA, and Dallas police had cost the American Nazis $25 million, approximately $2 billion in today's money. But they could afford it. In the years that followed, they cynically kept the war in Vietnam going by putting in just enough troops so that the line never moved forward or back. And while the American fat cats grew fatter on military-industrial contracts, their mafia friends used the CIA's complete immunity to smuggle trillions of dollars worth.
So he done said they did a body switch on JFK, used a cop to replace him, did some Frankenstein stuff, and like Face Off, like the movie Face Off, John Travolta and Nicolas Cage. And this is a wild story. Just
worth of cocaine and heroin around the world.
Sir, the Republicans are trying to blame you for the existence of a small air base at Mena, Arkansas. This base was set up by George Bush and Oliver North and the CIA to help the Iran-Contras, and they brought in plane load after plane load of cocaine there for sale in the United States. And then they took the money and bought weapons and took them back to the Contras, all of which was illegal, as you know, under the Bolin Act. But tell me, did they tell you that this had to be in existence because of national security?
Well,
this is crazy. Yeah, I totally switched the subject. But gang banging on Little Rock in the 90s, it was a documentary that came out. And there's a movie, I think it's called American Made, with Tom Cruise. That's a dope movie. It's a good movie about what she just talked about. It was delivering cocaine and financing a war and flooding the streets of America with dope. And Bill Clinton, number 42, president number 42. He was one of the main figures. Well, he was the governor of Arkansas, so he's letting all this go down.
Let me answer the question. No, they didn't tell me anything about it.
Of course, when criminals are making easy money, they tend to become lazy and careless, and this is what led to Watergate.
Someone's here.
Hold it, you must hold! Police! Put your hands up! Drop that jacket!
When the two plainclothes police officers switched the lights on in the Watergate building, who should they find hiding there? Frank Sturgis and Bernard Barker, who were working for E. Howard Hunt, exactly the same people who had murdered President Kennedy 9 years earlier. Sturgis even told the San Francisco Chronicle that the true reason for the burglary of the Watergate offices was to retrieve compromising pictures of CIA men in Dealey Plaza, which the Democrats were going to have published. Of course, somebody had to take a fall for conducting such a woefully sloppy operation. And when Howard Hunt found himself in prison for 33 months, he rather turned against his old friends for making him into the patsy on this occasion. He began sending messages to President Richard Nixon that he might just tell all he knew about what really happened in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. And one of Nixon's presidential aides, Dean Birch, recalls that when he heard about this, George Bush broke out all over in assholes and shit himself to death. It was this situation which led directly to what journalists now refer to as the Watergate murder, the crash of Flight 553. On December the 8th, 1972, Dorothy Wetzel Hunt, the wife of E. Howard Hunt, boarded a flight from Washington to Chicago. A CIA agent like her husband, she carried $250,000 in her bag, which was to bar the silence of his Watergate co-conspirators. Traveling along with Dorothy was CBS news correspondent Michelle Clark, whose CIA boyfriend had been able to give her a unique journalistic insight into what Watergate was really all about. These two women boarded the aircraft with a dozen other individuals who at that time had information which E. Howard Hunt claimed was going to blow the White House out of the water. As the plane made its final approach through fog and very low cloud, the people living near the aircraft runway sensed something rather strange was going on. The normally quiet suburban street suddenly filled up with cars, and a moment later, having been told to power down too early, Flight 553 emerged from the mist and clipped the branches of some trees before crashing on top of several bungalows on West 70th Street. The watching neighbors were then staggered to see FBI agents immediately leap out of their cars and start rooting around in the debris. a full 10 minutes before the fire brigade even arrived on the scene. 44 people, including Dorothy Hunt and Michelle Clark, were killed in the crash. E. Howard Hunt served his time and came out of prison a widower and $1 million richer. The Nazi shadow government of the United States had faced a blackmail threat and the possibility that their complicity in the murder of President Kennedy might become public knowledge. Their response was to bring down a civilian airliner onto a residential district. They covered it up by having FBI agents on the ground seek out and remove all incriminating documents from the dead bodies found in the wreckage. And when the local TV station received an anonymous phone call from a radio ham who had monitored the deliberately misleading exchanges from the Midway Control Tower, which caused 553 to crash, an FBI agent simply confiscated all the tapes, thus eradicating all information pertaining to the accident. This is how the agents of the US government now behave. They function essentially as a goon squad of mercenaries and murderers, hardly any different to Hitler's Gestapo, and are used as a private intelligence service and as personal hitmen for America's richest families. Their only role being to cover up the dirty tricks which the rich people are playing on their fellow countrymen every day. Along with threats and murder, the most important weapon used by this private army of footpads in this ongoing cover-up is disinformation. And it's here that we can now address a question which will probably be bothering the huge numbers of people who have taken an interest in the Kennedy assassination and in the many documentaries produced by assassination researchers over the years. What happened to Badgeman? The answer is very simple. He never existed. He was simply a phantom, created by the CIA's disinformation machine to lay down a trail which led nowhere. So now another question appears. If this is so, why have so many people spent a quarter of a century trying to discover his identity? By examining this question, it is now possible to reveal the extraordinary lengths America's rulers have gone to in order to hide the truth about the Kennedy assassination. America's oligarchs grossly underestimated the courage and skill of those who tried to uncover the truth about the Kennedy killing, none more so than the brilliant and tenacious Mark Lane. By the mid-1960s, his film Rush to Judgment had left the country in no doubt that they had been multiple gunmen acting together in some sort of conspiracy. Once he had proved this beyond any doubt, the only question remaining was, how big was the conspiracy? So it came as no surprise when polls started showing that 9 out of 10 Americans believed it had to be the CIA. This internal memorandum reveals just how nervous the agency was about this development. It spells out in no uncertain terms the concern spreading in the corridors of power and the urgent need to rectify this situation through the use of assets in the media. This great image problem led America's Nazis into initiating Operation Mockingbird, an ongoing policy of using the colossal wealth they were now amassing from drugs and weapons sales to buy up as many TV and film companies, newspapers, and local and national radio stations as they could lay their hands on, to the point where by the 1970s they were proudly boasting that everyone of any significance in the media is CIA.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
Virtually every well-known journalist, newspaper editor, and television presenter became a secret CIA agent, as did many entertainers and film stars. The question now was how best to use trusted public figures like Walter Cronkite. And this was how the first investigative documentaries about the Kennedy assassination came to be made. It will come as a terrific shock to those who have sought truth and solace in these many films, feature articles, and TV specials, to learn that every last one of them, including Oliver Stone's JFK, was...
Ooh, the TV been lying. Tell our vision. Tell lies to your vision. TV been lying forever. And, TV came out in like 1947, about 1955. Everybody had like one TV in like every household. So by the time 1963, when JFK gets smoked, everybody's watching the TV. Everybody had a TV in 1963. All right. So
it's actually produced by the CIA. A classic early example of this kind of disinformation was the Nova film, which featured two scientists, Brian Holstrom and Steve Isabel, who found Badgeman in a tiny fragment of the famous Mary Moorman Polaroid through photographic enhancement. But when investigators took the trouble to actually measure the size of these three figures, it became obvious that they were so tiny they were too small to even be children. Using the scale provided by Abraham Zabruda over on the right, it's clear that these alleged people are so lacking in stature, they wouldn't actually have been able to look over the stockade fence. The truth is that they never existed. And so the question now is, who were Holstrom and Isabel? And who, for that matter, was Gordon Arnold, the old-age pensioner who appeared in The Men Who Killed Kennedy to claim that Badgeman had kicked him and taken his camera?
I could be the only one that saw the man.
The answer is that they were all professional actors, because this is how the devil operates. Devils mix lies with truth in order to make the lies sound more plausible. And it seems that the idea for using actors in this way might very likely have come from E. Howard Hunt himself. After Hunt's deathbed confession, in which he admitted the involvement of the CIA, his son, St. John Hunt, posted many revealing statements about what kind of character his father was. It's quite well known that E. Howard Hunt wrote spy novels and screenplays. And when he was discussing this, St. John Hunt maintained his father tried to live his life as if every day was another exciting scene from a movie, to the total exclusion of his own family. The way St. John Hunt put it was, he would never cut carrots or go shopping with us or anything like that. James Bond doesn't have a family. Historians are well aware that the CIA studies everything, which is impressive, and it now seems very plain that they were greatly influenced by the brilliance of the Levinson and Link Columbo series, particularly one episode, Murder, Smoke and Shadows, in which the killer, who is a ruthless young movie director, tries to confuse and mislead Columbo through his powers of creating illusion, only to have the tables turned when this is done back to him. Because the whole point of that episode is that the audience never know who is and who isn't supposed to be an actor. The Men Who Killed Kennedy series was laid out in the same way. Whilst a few of the interviewees, like the Willis family, were genuine, most of the people claiming to be witnesses were simply actors whose only job was to keep people's minds on the grassy knoll, so they would never think about the storm drains and where the shots actually originated. Oliver Stone's film was made to serve exactly the same purpose. It's also very clear that the CIA spent a lot of time studying the emotional breakdown in interviews with people like the ambulance driver, Aubrey Reich. Intelligence agents are fully aware that when an audience sees someone sobbing from grief on screen, they tend to become emotional themselves. This is how sensitive, humane people react. And when this happens, you're no longer thinking. And when you're no longer thinking critically, when you suspend skepticism for the sake of emotionalism, you can be fooled.
I wanted to tell you why I grieve, but why I don't despair. I'm sorry.
Of course, having heard this, people will wonder how anyone could be cynical to such a degree, and it's a perfectly legitimate question, because as we shall see later, this would not be the last time that the American public were fooled by actors sobbing on national TV. And these monstrous fabrications were not confined only to television.
Saw the man.
In 2003, a book was published called Blood, Money and Power, ostensibly written by Texas law attorney Bar McClellan. This book signaled a shift in establishment policy by claiming that Lyndon Baines Johnson, a natural suspect as the king who might have killed the king, was behind the entire plot, and used his own attorney, Ed Clark, to pay off the gunman. Researchers noticed that at exactly the same time, a lot of information suddenly became available about all the murder plots LBJ had been involved in with Cliff Carter and Billy Solestes. We were then treated to the sensational deathbed confession of E. Howard Hunt. And in the book itself, the serious researchers found this extraordinary paragraph. Wallace centered on Kennedy's head and fired. The shot went almost 200 feet but was barely low and slightly to the right, hitting the president in the back shoulder blade. The bullet was deflected upward ever so slightly, exiting at the tie knot. The bullet's jacket separating to hit and crack the windshield, the remaining slug hitting the curbing in front of James Tague, an onlooker standing in front of the triple underpass on Commerce Street. The slug knocked cement shards in all directions. A splinter nicked Tague on the cheek. So just exactly what is going on here? This is quite obviously a ludicrous assertion. So what is it? Is it the CIA actually wrote this book? They knew that the critics had been able to laugh loud and long at the single bullet theory because the FBI had had to change their story. At first, They had accepted the indisputable evidence that James Tague was scratched by a bullet as he watched from below the overpass, because they initially claimed that the first shot alone had gone through the president and the governor, making 7 separate wounds in 2 different men. The second shot was the headshot, and presumably the third struck Tague. However, once the Zapruder film and dozens of eyewitnesses made it plain the first shot missed, the FBI had a problem. How could they account for the throat shot, headshot, and Tague shot with just 2 remaining bullets? This utterly ridiculous paragraph was a lame attempt after 40 years to come up with an answer, and the lengths the CIA went to get people to believe it were contrived, to say the least. It's first of all the simplest matter to refute this version of events by asking how the CIA could possibly know this is how it happened. The bullets splitting apart in midair? Are they saying they had Dealey Plaza rigged with fast motion cameras, which allowed them to replay the flight of every bullet in slow motion? If so, we'd all love to see those pictures. And even more to this, Barr McClellan's interview became the linchpin in the final episode of The Men Who Killed Kennedy, which was then banned from public broadcasting after a lawsuit was allegedly brought against the History Channel by former Presidents Carter and Ford and their friends Jack Valenti, Bill Moyers, and Lady Bird Johnson. Of course, this was just more disinformation. What the plotters hoped to achieve was that by getting the series banned, but making it available on the internet, the seekers after truth would be duped into thinking it must be true, precisely because it had been banned from mainstream media. It's a double bluff. It is quite possible, after all of this ludicrous skullduggery, that even the CIA themselves couldn't remember what purpose it was all supposed to serve. But the general idea was that the public was supposed to swallow the notion that Lyndon Baines Johnson was the primary culprit in this entire affair, because he's dead and can't speak for himself. It is absolute nonsense to suggest any such thing. Lyndon Baines Johnson was, like Hitler and Richard Nixon, a mere puppet of the oil men and the merchant bankers and military industrialists, something he finally admitted to.
I can't honestly say that I've ever been completely relieved of the fact that there might have been international connections.
You mean you still feel that there might have been?
Well, I have not completely discounted.
The notion that he was the criminal mastermind behind the Kennedy assassination is simply another disinformation falsehood dreamed up by the CIA. He was most definitely involved in the plot and offered up his personal hitman, Mac Wallace, to be part of it, but the men who actually masterminded the plot were Alan Dulles and David Atlee Phillips, with George Bush being the most important figure in the actual execution of the plan. And even they, in the end, proved themselves to be just as crude and obvious.
I knew George Bush had to be the most important person because they honor him. I'm like, he only had 4 years as president. Why do we love this dude so much? And why did he get the honor of being number 41? And the 13th prime number, 41. Why did he get that such high honor? It's because he's high on the list of people who did this. And even if you look back to that 2011 finals with Dirk Nowitzki represent this guy right here, George Bush. He won number 41. George Bush is a German American. Dirk Nowitzki from Germany. He won a title in 2011. He's a shooter. This is all about Bush. That was all about Bush.
Anyone else in the way they took care of anyone who might incriminate them. On the 22nd of February 1967, Eladio Del Valle and David Ferry were both murdered within minutes of each other when it seemed they might give information to the Jim Garrison investigation. Charles Boyd Harrelson and Milwaukee Phil Aldericio suffered convenient early deaths in jail, and having been ordered to testify before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, both Charles Nicoletti and George de Mohrenschildt were shot dead at the same time on the 29th of March 1977. Having been scheduled to testify before the same committee, Johnny Roselli met a similar fate. His body was found floating in an oil drum in Dumfounding Bay, Miami, just after Malcolm Wallace was murdered in exactly the same way as Lee Bowers. On a stretch of empty American highway, his car was forced off the road, then CIA agents smashed his head into the steering wheel until he died, to make it appear like a single-car accident. Not long afterwards, Sam Giancana was shot in the back of the head while cooking sausages, and his spy inside the Chicago police force, Richard Kane, was blasted to death with a sawn-off shotgun in Rose's sandwich shop on the 19th of December, 1973. Absolute proof that George H.W. Bush was the most important figure behind these grisly murders and the Kennedy assassination surfaced quite recently in a declassified FBI memo which revealed he was working for the CIA in 1963 and not from 77 onwards.
Come on, man. Your son get to be president too. This dude got too much pull to be that 4 year of trash that he did as a president. They was giving him way too much because he know too much.
As he'd always claimed. He had been a lifelong friend of George de Mohrenschildt, who had actually begged him for help when he realized the CIA were trying to kill him. It was therefore rather ironic that when the police checked de Mohrenschildt's wallet, they found an address card which gave them a direct lead straight to the guilty party had they but chosen to follow it up. It said George Poppy Bush, his CIA code name, Zapata Petroleum, Midland, Texas. It became a farewell note from the man who coordinated the crime of the century, a man whose father, Prescott Bush, had created the CIA in the first place, along with his friends some 30 years before, purely in order to take care of their own business interests. They arrogantly believed they were more intelligent than anyone. But in the end, the means the George Bush-led CIA chose to silence all the major underworld figures who might incriminate them proved to be every bit as crude and obvious as Ruby's killing of Oswald on television. The whole point of George Bush and his Central Intelligence Agency was that they were supposed to be intelligent, and yet in the end, they couldn't even fool little old ladies.
And who is going to inhibit them? The gangsters that are running this country is going to inhibit somebody.
All institutions of the American government are essentially a gangster syndicate, and everybody knows this. So perhaps it's time now to ask what we have learned and how best we can use this new understanding about the West's secret history to evaluate what is really going on in our world right now. To begin with, let's answer a couple of questions which have perplexed many people over the years. A great many researchers and historians have wondered why the Kennedy family themselves almost seem to be aiding and abetting the cover-up by choosing to be so quiet about the assassination itself. After the revelations of Chuck Giancana, there now seems little doubt that this is because they know a full disclosure of Joe Kennedy's dirty political dealings with the mafia would likely leave the Kennedy name in a very tarnished state. Up until now, history has tended to give the Kennedy patriarch a distinguished and squeaky clean image, which went along with his appointment as the American ambassador to Britain. Like most things about the ruling class, this image is false, because it's clear that Joe Kennedy was every bit as big a crook as his business associate, Sam Giancana. However, it also seems necessary now to revise the entire history of the Kennedy brothers. The reputation of Edward Kennedy never recovered from the Chappaquiddick incident, in which Mary Jo Kopechne lost her life when she drowned in his overturned car when he allegedly drove off this unlit bridge whilst under the influence.
They made
At
a
the
movie
time,
about
the
that.
public believed this was a married man misbehaving, but it's come to light recently that our old friends Frank Sturgis and E. Howard Hunt were seen in the Martha's Vineyard area just prior to the accident. Once again, it's the same dirty people pulling the same dirty tricks. The media's treatment of this affair destroyed any chance Edward Kennedy might have had of becoming president, and we do now have to wonder if this was yet another example of the CIA controlling public opinion. To the same end, it is also now clear why such venerable institutions as the BBC and other prominent European broadcasters have assisted in the cover-up. They always knew the Kennedy assassination was a can of worms, and that if the whole truth in the story were pursued vigorously, it would lead right back to the case of Auschwitz and the obscene profits which Europe's royalty and heads of state made from their investments in slave labor. This is a brutal truth which the West must now confront, and an equally brutal problem the United States must now face is the question of what has happened to the US military in the intervening years since it murdered its own commander-in-chief. The answer is that America's armed forces are now completely controlled by the American mafia. The mob don't even need hitmen anymore. They use United States Marines as assassins. They are, as Sam Giancana said, one organization who keep a low profile while they control the world as a business. And in an effort to prove this is so, in 1998, Pastor Rick Strawcutter videotaped a quite remarkable interview with Kay Pollard Griggs, formerly the wife of Colonel George Griggs, who for many years was the head of NATO. He was also an alcoholic of that well-known kind who are shy and unable to communicate when they are sober, but who then cannot stop talking once they have a drink. During the course of a stormy marriage, punctuated by periods of domestic violence, which cost Kay Griggs many black eyes and broken bones, she learned that her husband had been turned into a brutal psychopath as a consequence of his military training, which included induction into what is known as the Pink Triangle, the Cherry Marines. Over the years, far too much has been written about Lee Harvey Oswald. But what is remarkable is that few historians were ever aware that, like most Marines who worked in intelligence, he was homosexually recruited.
What?
And was part of the same-sex club, which included Jack Ruby, George Senator, and David Ferry. Kay Griggs explains that these selection procedures came into the US military when the cream of the death's head sporting Nazi top brass joined the American ranks at the war's end. Ever since then, the Greek and Spartan traditions which Hitler so admired, and which were integral to the German army, have found their way into American military culture and are now manifest in the way that the old skull and bones procedure for identifying and, most importantly, controlling rising stars is now used to select the top brass of the future. In a nutshell, boy soldiers who want to rise in the ranks can only do so by doing favors for the older men.
So George Bush, I mean, all these people rise up through the ranks, the same club. Right. No wonder, you know, I saw a little TV clip one time where a reporter was asking George Bush and others about the Order of the Skull and Bones.
You were both in Skull and Bones, the secret society. It's so secret we can't talk about it. What does that mean for America?
I mean, if this really got out, that these guys are all inducted because they've got some kind of homosexual thing on them.
Indoctrination. I mean, or induction. They have to do that.
Yeah.
They do that.
Yeah.
Even in a coffin. And it's even now coming into the military totally. The chiefs do that. They put them in the coffin. They do the bowling ball trick.
Okay, you're going to explain this. What happens when you get in the coffin? Why do you get in a coffin?
Oh, they get, when you get your eagles, that's a German thing.
Okay.
You know, it's what the German high command did. And most of them, you know, had the boyfriends and stuff, the Krupps and all of that. It is a German thing that they say goes back to Greece, and it's all the male Marine looking men that they do it with. See? So now the chiefs have to do that. What they do is they get, George said it's like a zoo. They get everybody really drunk, and they sometimes call it dining in. Shellback is another time that they do it. Not everybody does it, but the ones who do it, if they're young, they get right up to the top. It's a
okay. Well, what actually do they do? They've got a coffin. They get
anal
inside
sex. Oh, that they do. They put them in the coffin and they do things.
This is how military recruits are now controlled, and the mafia military exert a similar hold over all career politicians. At some time on the way up, they are maneuvered into a compromising position, usually through the use of two-way mirrors in a brothel. And once the mafia military have got something on them, the career politicians, judges, senior police officers, and media moguls face a stark choice. Either take your payoff, which is usually worth millions of dollars, or go to jail for life for your misdemeanor. It is with these kinds of tactics, first used by Sam Giancana in the 1930s, that what are now known as the five mafia families of the New York metropolitan area, the Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, and the Bonanno, control all politics in the United States, and through their business arrangements with the five-star generals and CIA, control all cocaine and heroin trafficking throughout the entire world. After the dust had settled on the Kennedy assassination, Sam Giancana explained to his younger brother that the mob and the CIA had taken care of JFK together because they were essentially two sides of the same coin. In the last 50 years, that relationship between these two secret societies has become even closer, to the point where they are now indistinguishable. The people who live in the third world are so well aware of what is really going on, they have come to call the CIA the cocaine importing agency. The World Wide Web now abounds with proof to back this up. And although many people were skeptical at first about Kay Griggs, in recent times, her most sensational claims have been fully endorsed by the FBI chief Ted Gunderson, who gave several interviews in support.
This cult was involved in distributing drugs up and down the East Coast, drugs that were being flown in from Southeast Asia in military and planes. The operation was by the certain Army personnel and also CIA. She told me that there were generals involved in the drug operation.
I got Big Pharma now. They still selling drugs. And they went over to Afghanistan, got all that dope, brought it back, got everybody on dope.
There were police officers and at least two attorneys in the Fayetteville, North Carolina area. The path that this led me down is mind-boggling. Over the last 23, 24 years, I have developed so much information about the situation as it exists in our great country and gone public with it as much as possible, and yet I'm being ignored.
What is basically happening is that the United States military use Air Force bases in Europe to connect with the third world, particularly Pakistan and Afghanistan, where the poppy fields are cultivated. This is the real reason for the conflict in Afghanistan. It's to protect the record harvests of heroin, which almost ended when the Taliban took power. But they don't tell the soldiers this, and it's a truth you'll never hear on NBC or BBC. Having brought the refined cocaine and heroin into Europe and the United States, it is then passed on to the mafia for sale at street level, sometimes by police officers in uniform. It's an arrangement which nets the generals and the mafia chiefs billions, and the fact that someone of Ted Gunderson's credibility was completely ignored when he went public with this information underlines the fact that our entire mainstream media, as well as the entire justice system, has been bought off. So the question must now be asked: if this shadow government of the world's only superstate can get away with the murder of a president and through their wealth be in total control of the United States military, media, and the justice system, what else might they be getting away with? Could it possibly be that the serious researchers have been right all along? And remember something very wrong with the 9/11 TV coverage. First along came Dylan Avery with his amazing film Loose Change. He proved conclusively that the official report was nonsense because aircraft fuel does not burn at even half the temperature required to melt steel, and that the towers defied the laws of physics by collapsing with perfect uniformity at free fall speed. Buildings in Germany which were bombed over and over again didn't collapse with perfect uniformity down to ground level. Avery also pointed out that in Kennedy's time, his chiefs of staff drafted plans to kill innocent people and commit acts of terrorism in the United States in order to whip up support for a war with Cuba, codenamed Operation Northwoods. These plans included hijacking planes and blowing up ships and landmark buildings in order to stimulate a helpful wave of national indignation which could be used to oust Fidel Castro. And there wasn't anything exceptional in this initiative. Northwoods was an offshoot of the notorious Operation Gladio, a sustained campaign organized by MI6 and the CIA, which perpetrated many bombing atrocities in post-war Europe, which they blamed on what they said were communist terror organizations. A typical example was the horrific bombing of Bologna railway station in 1980. Italians will be appalled to learn this outrage was committed by the Americans and the British. But this particular atrocity, which like all others during this period was intended to keep people living in fear of a bogus enemy, so they would accept increasing state control by so-called strong leaders, illustrates only too well the fact that some 40 years prior to 9/11, the cabal of secret Nazis who killed Kennedy were making serious preparations for terrorist attacks upon their European allies and even upon their own country. In the 9/11 news footage, it is abundantly clear that the interviewees are actually paid actors, speaking lines which have been written for them.
I feel like I was in a movie.
This is exactly the same situation as in The Men Who Killed Kennedy. And because these are people who are being expected to perform, they tend to overdo it.
I could be the only one that shot the man. They killed the president. And to be honest with you, if I'd have known this, I wouldn't have given any interview.
It is perfectly clear that the 9/11 street people are trying much too hard to convince their audience.
Approximately several minutes after the first plane had hit, I saw this plane come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
9/11 was in reality just another CIA special effects movie production. And it really has become the Kennedy assassination's long-lost twin, because witnesses who know the truth of what really happened are all being murdered. This didn't stop some people from immediately pointing out that the London Tube bombings were a hoax. The alleged terrorists couldn't have ridden into London on a train which was cancelled. And seasoned researchers are now becoming quite surprised at how sloppy and obvious these alleged terrorist acts are becoming. Any detective would instantly realize the Woolwich terror incident was a joke. We were shown pictures of a supposedly decapitated man lying prone on the street. If that were true, he should be lying in a puddle of his own blood, and the alleged attacker would be soaked in blood all over his front from arterial spray. All terrorism is fake. It is military deception practiced by the rich upon the poor in an ongoing class war. And the most important weapon at their disposal in this class war are television presenters. The BBC has actually become the Ministry of Truth from Orwell's 1984. Everyone working for the BBC today is a whore of the ruling class and a traitor to our way of life, because it is very hard to believe they are all unwitting accomplices in this class war. When we remember that it was some of the BBC's own journalists who revealed that the 9/11 hijackers were all alive, It's hard to accept that their news presenter colleagues haven't figured out the totalitarian nature of what people like Jane Stanley, who reported the collapse of World Trade Center 7 20 minutes before it came down, are really up to. And yet still they go on giving us reassuring smiles while telling lies on behalf of the ruling class. Of course, then people ask, oh, yes, but why would they do it? Why is all of this Muslim, multicultural, political correctness thing happening to us right now? It's happening because we no longer have an enemy. Tourists today can visit what used to be the Eastern Bloc, and they can photograph the derelict rusting heap of scrap metal, which used to be the Soviet war machine. It has gone, and this has created an unprecedented political situation which the world has never seen before, in which there is only one superstate, the Anglo-American alliance. No other power on earth today is capable of fighting a war on the grand scale. China, North Korea, Russia simply do not have.
I've been telling people this. I said, man, America, China and Russia could team up. America would fuck all of them up. It's not even close. Russia got that old ass technology. China can't fly. We would fuck them up. They do not. You ain't got to worry about no war.
The economic resources. So in order to make us believe we still have an enemy and therefore have to live in fear, the rich had to provide us with a new enemy. And this is why in recent years they've encouraged unstable Islamic people to emigrate to the West. It's to provide
these niggas throwing rocks. Like come on, man. It ain't even close.
Provide us with a ready-made enemy. This is their master plan for this single superstate age. And it's for this reason that they perverted political correctness to make people believe that anybody who refuses to go along with this new doctrine of multiculturalism is the worst person of all. In the West today, we've become quite used to seeing confrontations between the alleged lunatic fringe of Islam and indigenous white men who are trying to defend their culture from foreign influences. What groups like the EDL do not understand, however, is who is really pulling the strings here? Who is behind this? Who arranged this fight? Because any Roman senator would tell you this is simply the old maxim of divide and rule. The Romans invented this system. They always made sure that every conquered region pushed together tribes who were traditionally hostile to one another. The British copied this method after World War I by redrawing the entire map of the Middle East to make sure that the new boundaries always set one Arab tribe against another, particularly the Kurds. What we see on the streets of Britain and America today is the same thing. The whole idea is that while you're fighting against Muslims and they're fighting against you, no one has the time to stop and think about who actually created this situation and who their real enemy really is. The rulers of the Middle Ages arranged a never-ending religious war between Catholic and Protestant for precisely the same reason. Now, why must we always think we have an enemy? Because the ruling group always maintain their position in society by controlling the population through fear. Think about it. If we don't have an enemy, would the public be prepared to pay for the army? Would we be happy to pay for MI5 so that they can read our emails and put a surveillance camera on every street corner? Big Brother has to have an excuse for watching us all the time. And what they call national security is always the perfect excuse. The moment you make a world at peace, it's gone.
It's a wrap.
The keystone in the arch of ruling class power is gone if we don't have an enemy. So the rich are always going to provide us with an enemy forever. And the lesson we need to learn from all of this is that everything in our lives is and always has been a rich man's trick. When people think of ancient Rome, they always tend to think about the gladiators in the Roman arena. But something people don't realize is that Roman amphitheaters were a scam. They were perhaps the very first big confidence trick in human history, played by more cunning rich men upon a naive public. What Caesar did was to say to the Roman Vulgate, I will give you gladiatorial games, but only if I can have your votes. And he only offered this bargain because he knew the Vulgate loved the games more than they loved anything. This is how the Roman maxim, panem et circenses, bread and circuses, became established. Because Caesar was the first politician to understand that if you give people what they want, they will tolerate being ruled. By this means, Julius Caesar made himself the first dictator whose fortune was protected by a professional army. And everything that every ruler has given us since Caesar has simply been another rich man's trick. Religion is a rich man's trick. It was invented because wealthy rulers realized the population was getting too big for soldiers to watch over constantly. So they replaced the idea of having many gods with one single god, a simple idea simple men could understand, who could see what everyone was doing all the time. The idea of one god became the surveillance video of the ancient world. In the Middle Ages, the same sort of people grew rich by charging people for the forgiving of sins. And when a new age dawned with the coming of
And then the Freemason cosmology is that looking down on people.
Industrial Revolution, they invented new tricks to control the population explosion, like censorship. Every grown-up knows that there is one law for the rich and one law for the rest, because the justice system is a rich man's trick. Mafia godfathers like Sam Giancana walked free from American criminal courts over and over again by taking the Fifth Amendment, because it is a criminal's law. And it's the same with everything else. The media is a rich man's trick. The tax system, because the rich never pay any tax, is a rich man's trick. Political correctness is a rich man's trick. The murder plot to kill Lady Diana Spencer was a rich man's trick. And the war on terror, 9/11, the London Tube bombings, the Woolwich terror attack, the Kennedy assassination, all of it is simply another rich man's trick controlling how we think. Now, once again, it is very easy at this point to imagine the reaction of conservative politicians, who will, of course, try to laugh this off and scoff. Everything is a rich man's trick? Are we seriously suggesting that the Cold War was a rich man's trick?
Now, in your research and analysis and your efforts to bring out the facts about what was going on in our society, did you encounter any effort to discourage you, to prevent you from bringing out the background of America's involvement in the financing of international communism?
Yes, very definitely. For example, when I was at the Hoover Institution, in 1972, I went to Miami Beach to give some testimony before the Republican National Committee. And although a congressman had hand-delivered to the wire services this testimony, which was later printed, the wire services refused to transmit it to the newspapers. Then when I got back to the Hoover Institution in California, I was called into the office of the director, and I was told in no uncertain terms not to make any more speeches like that, and that this information should not be made public.
This was the information that we were giving the Soviet Union the technology to develop its war potential?
Oh, yes. At that time, we were in Vietnam, and as you know, the Soviets were supplying the North Vietnamese.
This was 1972.
1972, yes. And for example, I knew that the Gorky plant, which was built by the Ford Motor Company, the Gorky plant in Russia produces the GAZ series of vehicles. The GAZ vehicles had been seen on Ho Chi Minh Trail. We were supplying equipment to the Gorky plant in the middle of the Vietnamese War, and these trucks were being used to carry ammunition supplies, which were killing Americans. I thought this was morally wrong, and I said so in Miami Beach and at the Hoover Institution. And it was this type of information that was suppressed.
The rich would much rather we didn't think at all, and certainly not about the wise words of the columnist Claire Rayner, who once famously said that the only reason we now have to live under kings and queens and presidents is that in past ages their ancestors were the best thieves. In the Middle Ages, when the king was feeling greedy and wanted to pay for a new mistress or grand new palace, he simply sent out his robber barons to steal half the herd of every local farmer. And if they complained, the robber barons would say the king needed to feed the army, or some similar excuse. That is how it was done then. But today, the ruling class face a different problem. We now live in an industrial age, and as George Orwell explains in his novel 1984, if the machine age was directed solely with the intention of making the common people physically comfortable, in a mega-productive, computer-controlled epoch, we could soon all live like millionaires. But think what this would mean. If we're all millionaires, we all fly first class. So the king and the queen and the president have to wait in a queue with everyone else. And do you honestly believe the Queen of England would wait in a queue behind you? If we're all millionaires, we all play golf. The king and the president can't get on the course. And there's no room on their exclusive beach. Orwell himself would have said the most important single sentence in 1984 was this one. If it once became general, wealth would confer no distinction. Our lords and masters are not going to wait in queues with the rest of us. So the special problem which fat cats face today is how to keep the wheels of industry turning, because as Orwell explains, the oligarchs have to make use of the masses without significantly raising the general standard of living. This is a more sophisticated age, so the robber barons need a more sophisticated means of stealing most of the wealth and of keeping most of the common people in poverty. What the rich face today is a situation in which the common people spend most of their lives on a 9-to-5 treadmill. They make things in factories, they grow things and harvest them, they teach in the schools, nurse in the hospitals, and as a result of their daily labours, a huge mountain of money is produced. Now the rulers have a problem. How can they keep the ordinary people hard at work so they're too exhausted at the end of every day to think about whether this is a fair system? The solution, as Sam Giancana explained, is to invent a foreign enemy, a boogeyman, who wants to conquer the whole world. This becomes a perfect excuse to make people pay for a sophisticated array of increasingly expensive weapons which are made by companies which the fat cats themselves own. And in one neat little scam, the modern robber baron has a means of stealing most of the wealth produced by Western society while leaving the common people with just enough crumbs to keep them going. Every year, America's oligarchs take $3 trillion out of the United States economy.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
2.3 trillion with a T. That's $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in America.
This is how the rich have rigged the system, so that it benefits them at the expense of everyone else all the time. But in order to keep this fraud going, the public must always be convinced of the need for military expenditure. This is where all the phony terrorism comes in. And if we want to find out who is behind this ongoing hoax, we only have to look at Securicom, the company in charge of World Trade Center security, who removed all guards and sniffer dogs from the buildings on September 10th, so that the charges which brought down the towers in controlled explosions could be planted. If we now ask, who is the chief of Securicom, who do we find? Marvin P. Bush, brother of George W. Bush, son of the man who orchestrated the plot to assassinate President Kennedy, and grandson of the man who made the family fortune from Auschwitz slave labor. The Bush family and their rich friends have been behind all of it. During his time as president, George W. Bush connived with Tony Blair to introduce a deliberate policy of allowing unbalanced and aggressive Muslims to flood into Western countries. They did this in the hope that they would commit atrocities in their adopted countries, and they were actually delighted when the Washington, D.C. sniper and the Fort Hood shootings made headlines, because they knew such events would make it easier for the public to swallow the idea that 9/11 was simply more typical Islamic terrorism. The truth is that Islam is simply being used like a pawn on a chessboard in a game the fat cats have been playing since World War I. 70 years ago, they gave us what they called their Hitler Project. 50 years ago, it was the JFK assassination project. Today, we're having to suffer the War on Terror project. And when this current lunacy is over, they'll have another excuse ready to create yet another phony war and yet another patsy. If George Orwell was still alive today, and he was asked to comment upon all the significant political events of the last decade, it's quite likely he would simply restate the Orwellian definition of totalitarianism, to wit, a society living by and for continuous warfare, in which the ruling caste have ceased to have any real function but succeed in clinging to power through force and fraud, and then ask whether this sounds like the world we live in. Because it ought to be obvious by now that our seemingly endless economic recessions are being deliberately orchestrated. In today's world, the commodities markets are arranged in such a way that the price of virtually everything, particularly food, hardly ever changes. So how then can it be that the price of oil increased tenfold in the last decade? Economists are now tacitly agreeing that this was due to financialization, which is just a fancy way of saying rich creeps like the Bush family and their merchant banking friends used their trillionaire fortunes to rig the market. Why did they do this? Because great entrepreneurs like Stelios, with their budget air travel, had managed to break the cartel of the major airlines. Ordinary working families had begun living a jet-set lifestyle. The ruling elite of the entire world was simply terrified, because a jet-set lifestyle is supposed to be the exclusive preserve of the rich. What would happen to their social status if the whole world were part of the jet set? So the rich arranged for the credit crunch, and now working families who used to fly 10 times a year can't even afford to use their car. What George Orwell understood better than anyone is that every age is basically the same. It is always a story in which a small elite group of greedy people cling to unjust power and privileges by practicing an ongoing deception upon their followers. Caesar did it with bread and circuses in the Roman arena. George Bush did it with false flag terrorism on 9/11. British newspapers have told their readers that the Queen of England is only the 10th richest person in the UK with a fortune of $3 billion. But experts who have calculated her real wealth reckon that her ownership of 1/6 of all the land on planet Earth puts her true fortune nearer to 22 trillion. And they also estimate the true wealth of the Queen's merchant bankers, the Rothschilds, the people who started all of this greed by lending money to the Harrimans and the Morgans, to be at least 100 trillion. So finally, we have to ask, what is to be done about all this? For in the case of America, it is obvious that in order to honor the memory of President Kennedy, Americans are now duty-bound to finish his work by finally ending the worldwide tyranny of the CIA. The time has come for for ordinary Americans to ask their strongmen in uniform just exactly what and who they think they are defending. And they better not take too long about it. Having established Islam in the West in order to provide us with an enemy, the elite have recently started on the second phase of their master plan, which is to wipe out anyone who is sick or disabled. In Britain, this has been manifest in the Atos scandal, which has stopped all welfare payments to people with terminal illnesses and allowed invalids who in some cases have no limbs to starve to death. The extermination of anyone considered feeble-minded or infirm was exactly how the Nazi regime began. And now they've started doing it again. What most amazes me in all of this is the naivety of the good people in the truth movement who go on and on and on saying they want an independent inquiry. The Bush family and their rich friends are not going to investigate themselves. And there isn't any authority on earth above that of the ruling class, so it's never going to happen. These people have got the police and the judges and the justice system completely under their control. The Queen of England cannot be prosecuted for anything, not even genocide, in a Crown Court, because the Crown Courts are hers. She owns British justice. The only way to change our corrupt system is through revolution. Everyone has to sign up to the Revolution Now website. And then the people have to march on Washington, just as they did for CIA agent Barack Obama's inauguration. Only this time, they need to kick him and every other crooked politician out and take power genuinely for the people's sake. And once again, they better not take too long about it, because the last time the rich decided to play a really big trick on the world, 6 million lives were extinguished. Supposing they decide to give us the world's first incidence of phony nuclear terrorism by dropping an atomic bomb on Cleveland or Birmingham or on Chicago, what then? But perhaps Chicago itself might be a good place to pause and offer a word of warning to the citizens of the United States before they start thinking about the next American Revolution. We should always remember that Al Capone was seen as a hero by the ordinary working people of his own time because he gave them what they wanted: booze, sex, gambling, and drugs. And some Americans have even been candid enough to admit this.
We all play numbers, we all go to the racetrack, you know what I mean? We all cheat a little bit.
It hardly needs saying that Giancana, Marcello, and Trafficante would have gone out of business in no time if ordinary Americans hadn't been so fond of cocaine. And in the post-war period, many writers have noted the way in which the United States not only manifestly tolerated organized crime, but even seemed to be enchanted by it. It's a cultural phenomenon which has led many foreigners to wonder whether there is some sort of latent criminality in the very fabric of American society. Right. Because there does seem to be some sort of tacit agreement amongst all Americans that killing a man should always be considered an option.
And that's another reason why I said Russia and China, they don't want no smoke with America. We just prone to violence, man. I watch UFC every weekend, bro. It's like we just used to violence. We just it's in the DNA. It's American. It's American pie. It's violence. Rambo and Hulk Hogan and just Mike Tyson. We just watch Mike Tyson and Jake Paul. Like we just love that shit. Not bragging about it, but it is what it is.
It looks as if he might cost you a large sum of money.
I suppose we'll have to kill him. I don't suppose you have any ideas on that, Diana.
Well, what would you fellas say to an assassination?
I hope you don't have any hidden tape machines in this office, Frank. We're talking about a capital crime here.
I'd like to hear some more opinions on that.
I don't see we have any option, Frank. Let's kill this son of a bitch.
This film is likely to leave Americans with the impression that JFK was assassinated by a corrupt and brutal ruling class. Perhaps they should ask themselves if they are quite sure that he wasn't simply killed by America. So it seems that finally we are left with a very simple question. What kind of society is it which kills its own best men?
That was a dope documentary, man. Round of applause for that guy, man. Britain, London, they bring the smoke, man. It's real hardcore. He didn't hold back at all, you know. London, them troopers over there, bro. They go full body, hard body. He didn't hold back no punches. That was a dope documentary, man. All right. Peace to y'all, man. Hit the like button on the way out. Like, comment, subscribe. We up out of here. Peace.